Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour.
So, ladies and gentlemen, hello. Welcome to this workshop, which will be dealing with a hot-button topic, the recording of vital statistics in conflict and emergency situations, and also focus on innovation. Now, I'm very pleased to see so many of you here today for this workshop, not only because we have excellent panelists, but also because this session will deal with a difficult topic, complex topic, and which requires us to think together about it if we're to move forward with the registration, the recording of vital statistics in conflict and emergency situations. I'm from UNICEF, Western Africa, Central Africa Division, and it's not just by chance that I was asked to moderate this session. Our area is one of the most affected by conflict, armed conflict, and other types of emergencies, unfortunately so. It also has a direct impact on the low level of registration of deaths and births. Before we allow the panelists to make their presentations this morning, I'd like to ask two questions for us as a group. And you can be thinking about those questions during this workshop. First question. I would like to ask the following question. Let's think about what lessons we can learn from the work that's been done on the organization of CRVS systems in conflict and emergency situation, which will help us to better manage future emergencies and conflicts. That's the first question. Second question, what are the innovations that have been developed or used or put in place to improve the registration of vital statistics in emergency situations? So after the presentations, I hope that we'll have enough time for a thorough discussion with you. And I hope that we'll have a better appreciation of the questions I've just asked you. And I hope that we'll be able to come up with some recommendations after this workshop. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first panelist, who is Mr. Dimitri Sanga. He works for the UNECA. He's director of the Regional Office for West Africa, and he'll be talking to us about CRVS in conflicts and emergencies. This is the first presentation. Mr. Sanga, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Mirkka, and thanks to everyone who's here today for this session. I wouldn't be bold enough to say that I have all the answers to the registration of vital statistics in emergency situations. I don't have all the answers, but I will be putting forward today a case, a practical case study of how things actually work. And I'd like you to remember three things from my presentation. First thing, I don't know how many of you know the Sahel countries. I hope that after my presentation you'll have a better idea of what those countries are like. Secondly, we're talking about a region which is prone to problems of insecurity, displacement of population. It's also a region that has a lot of potential as well. Third thing, I'll be giving you an example of how countries are trying to manage, trying to take action to continue to register vital statistics despite the problems of insecurity. And finally, I will be calling for those who are able to, be it technically or financially speaking, help these countries to continue to register the vital statistics in these situations, these tough situations. These are the things I'd like you to take from my presentation, and things that I would like you to take back to your various organizations. Now, very quickly, I don't know if we can move it forward. Can I use it with this? Can I move it forward with the clicker? All right. Nope. Not working. The other button? All right, there we go. So first of all, I'd like to give you a definition of the Sahel. There are several definitions. It's a region which is between subtropical Africa and the Sahara Desert to the north. Under the UN Nations definition, there are 10 countries: Burkina Faso, Cameroon, Gambia, Guinea, Mali, Mauritania, Nigeria, Senegal, and Chad as well. We're talking here a large region for two reasons. First of all, a population of 315 million people, representing about a quarter, 25% of the total African population and 4% of the world population as well. So if something happens there, it should be of interest to all of us. Secondly, it also has economic clout. It represents about 24% of the African economy. Now, if we look at the region more closely, it's increasingly subject to problems of insecurity. First of all, for those of you who follow the news, this region is home to Lake Chad. And as we speak, Lake Chad has dropped by 90% over 50 years. Now you can imagine fishers, farmers, livestock farmers who lived made a living from the area around Lake Chad. You can imagine that with a drop in 90% in water levels, that's caused major problems. It's caused a lot of problems. There are problems between fishermen, between livestock farmers, and in addition, since 2009, we've seen the emergence of Boko Haram. I'm sure you've heard about them. They're active in that region, and that adds to the issues that already existed, like climate change. Then there was the Mali crisis in 2011. Almost the whole of Mali was occupied by jihadis, and that's not over yet. Then there was the crisis in Libya in 2011. Those with money, with weapons, flooded the country, Libya, into Mali, into Chad, into the north of Cameroon, and Nigeria as well. And of course, that brings with it new insurrections, jihadi groups, and all sorts of liberation movements. So we think that about 21% of those groups are focused in these 10 countries in the Sahel region. Now, of course, with that, we have other issues like drug trafficking, weapons trafficking, human trafficking, crime, etc. So there are various impacts here. Now, first, to impact displacement and movement of people. In December 2016, we estimated that there were about 4.9 million people who had left their homes. 2.4 million people were displaced because of Boko Haram violence. So we're talking about 2 million alone in Nigeria. In December 2016, 11 million people in this area were in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. In terms of development now, 10% of the population is exposed to food insecurity. 1 in 5 children under 5 suffers from acute malnutrition in this area as well. Now, in terms of climate change, that's ongoing. I talked about Lake Chad, which is dropping, but we're seeing droughts every 5 years. Of course, these countries don't have diversified economies, and poverty means that the majority of these countries are at the bottom of the human development scale. Now, why is the registration of vital statistics important in these countries? 4 reasons. First of all, Many of you have had the opportunity to visit refugee camps, camps for displaced peoples, and you see that life goes on. Babies are born, there are weddings, there are people who die in those camps as well. So you can't claim that you can just forget those camps because life goes on, even when these people are facing insecurity. Second impact, if we have a vital statistic registration system in a country where there's insecurity, it means that that system is very robust. Protection of human rights, of children, of women, and others. And this all depends on the registration of their vital statistics for help to be given to these people. We need to know who these people are. And thirdly, we have to try to avoid statelessness. We must preserve the right to citizenship in the country of origin or in the host country as well. Further reasons? Humanitarian assistance. Countries need to be able to monitor their populations. They need to be identified. So what do we need? We need statistics for that, for the programs and projects which allow us to help these people. Now, what's the state of the vital statistics registration system in the Sahel countries? Countries in the Sahel are represented in yellow here, and when it's red, you'll see that the registration rate is under 50%. We're talking here about 30%, 12% in Chad. Now, if we compare what's happening in the various countries in the Sahel, now, my group is responsible for these countries. Now, if you look at what we have in red here, that's the Sahel countries. So no matter what variable you used here, the overall performance of the system, digitization, cause of death, you'll see that in general, Sahel countries are very, very poorly placed in terms of the rest of Africa. Now, despite all that, there are examples where innovations have been put in place to capture vital statistics in these situations. Niger is one of them. Now, they decided to go into the refugee camps to transform those camps into registration centers and to identify and authenticate people's identity, and also to issue documents in the camps. In 2007, 309,000 refugees were checked, 1,454 birth certificates were issued, 61 marriage certificates, and 41 death certificates were issued. So now Mali and Niger have worked together to deal with the cases of Mali children who were born in Mali but who were displaced into Niger. Both countries have to talk to each other to make sure that a child was in fact born in Mali, even if that child is currently in Niger. Now, the Difa era, that's around Lake Chad, which is bordered by the north of Nigeria, Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. There are about 250,000 refugees, people who have returned, and displaced persons. 61% of this population has no identity document at all. This means that these people are not eligible for citizenship either in Niger or in Nigeria. So basically, they become stateless. Now, I'd like to end here by reminding you that the Sahel faces recurrent emergencies, and nothing seems to indicate that this will change in the short term. As we've seen, there is very little attention paid to the registration of vital statistics in these countries. We think that partners in the future should perhaps ensure that when they're funding humanitarian assistance, that they should not forget to take into account that the registration of vital statistics is necessary. And we have to develop tools and guides which will allow for the registration of vital statistics in these situations, because life goes on even if people are facing an emergency situation. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very enlightening. Your presentation on the situation in Sahel countries who are going through various difficulties, tough times. One of the difficulties is the registration of vital statistics. And thank you also for the recommendations that you've made for partners, more specifically how we can improve the situation not only in the Sahel, but I think this is something which would apply also to all types of emergency situations. We'll now move on to the next presentation, which will be given by Mr. Fodé Touré, and he's the head of Population Services and Statistics, Guinea. He will be giving us a specific overview of a country. He'll be talking to the issue of Guinea, which has gone through the Ebola crisis. Thank you very much. Over to you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Hello. I am Fodé Oumar Touré. I'm Head Division of Population Services and Statistics for the Government of Guinea in the Republic of Guinea. I would like to start by thanking the Centre of Excellence for looking at CRVS and for having given me the opportunity to take part in this high-level conference here in Canada, and it's my first time here in Canada, by the way. Now, the Republic of Guinea is a Western African country which has an area of 245,000 square kilometers with a population of 12.1 million people in 2016. 342 rural and urban areas. Each of these areas has its own vital statistics registration system. Now, today, my presentation will focus on the registration of vital statistics in an emergency situation in Guinea, and I'll be focusing on the Ebola crisis. I will also be talking about the vital statistic registration in the context of Ebola in Guinea, and then I'll be talking about the action taken in the context of the Ebola crisis and the post-Ebola crisis. Thirdly, I'll be presenting the lessons that learned and best practices for civil society. And then I will be talking about the weak response to the Ebola crisis and the lack of focus on the registration of vital statistics. And I'll talk a bit about the future as well.
Okay. Okay, dole. No. Okay. Okay.
Now, after that introduction, Let's start with the issues and the challenges facing countries in emergency situation. There are various types of emergency situations in Africa. Over the past few years, the Republic of Guinea has faced various situations and the consequences of which have been felt by vital statistics registration, while conflicts in neighboring countries, Ivory Coast, Liberia, Gambia, Mali, to name but a few, the emergency situation, the public health emergency situation, also the Ebola epidemic. Now, these emergency situations have led to issues with the registration of vital statistics. Various human rights abuses have occurred. Women's rights, children's rights, the right to citizenship, to name but a few. The possibility that you might lose your vital statistics creates various additional problems. This is especially true in during natural disasters, during the massive displacement of populations and conflicts, and can lead to the breakdown of the vital statistics registration system. And in extreme cases, it can lead to its complete collapse.
Les certificats de naissance et de décès finissent par
various members of the population facing emergency situations often lose their death or birth certificates and archives. Whole archives can, in fact, be destroyed during or after the crisis. And this can be caused by ethnic conflict, social conflict. It can be through contested elections. It can have an impact on the vital statistics registration system. Like in many countries affected by crisis, the healthcare sector and education sector are generally the beneficiaries of interventions through public policy. They benefit from support by the United Nations and other world organizations. But I think that vital statistics processes are the poor relation. Births, marriages, and deaths continue to occur without the being registered. In some communities, the social and cultural practices, traditional practices like early marriages, early births, where there's no medical assistance, continue to occur as well. Now, local communities who are responsible for registering vital statistics are not very sensitive to the events taking place within those communities. They wish to avoid criticism by local populations who elect them. And of course, they know that they have to meet their needs with scarce resources. At the same time, the statistics system for the registration of deaths often don't exist at all, or are full of gaps and fragmented and based on data from various sources. However, despite the various difficult tasks linked to emergency situations, conflict situations, it's extremely important to maintain and to restore basic registration services if we wish to make sure that human rights are met, if you wish to build an effective state and to provide for good governance. At the third conference of African ministers responsible for vital statistic registration in Yamoussoukro in 2015, a recommendation was made to countries to define directives for managing vital statistic systems in situations situations of emergency and conflict situations, and also in other situations based on the experience in other countries that have gone through the same type of issues. Now, the problems the problem of vital statistic registration in Guinea in the context of Ebola. Ebola started in various countries around Guinea and forced people to be displaced into Guinea. We were faced with people suffering from Ebola who actually died in Guinea and had to be registered. That led to various issues in the communities where they were displaced to. Now, actions taken in the context of Ebola and the post-Ebola period to promote the registration of vital statistics. The epidemic affected areas where there was already a high concentration of refugees from neighboring countries. The involvement of the HCR in the registration of births in the camps and the availability of HCR staff to help with this process and the absence of trained staff for registration were all problems. Now, lessons learned and best practices in terms of the response to Ebola. The development of epidemiological oversight systems which are more effective based on the recruitment of community health workers and on people to register deaths. The institutionalization of the monitoring process and departments working together which decided that all deaths should be registered on a daily basis. The strengthening of the collection of data at the community level, along with the cause of death, the strengthening of the use of local information in villages, the strengthening of the health information system on the causes of death. Now, the weaknesses of the response to Ebola concerned the interoperability of the epidemiological and vital statistic oversight systems. Now, some deaths were pre-registered. They were pre-registered through epidemiological monitoring. There was an absence of an interoperability mechanism with vital statistics. There was an absence of a mechanism for the collection of data which could be used by vital statistics agencies. Now, the future. As part of the reform strategy and the modernization strategy for vital statistics registration, the MATD department has committed to integrate registration of refugees into the work of the Vital Statistics Office to avoid statelessness, to develop an interoperability protocol designed to strengthen cooperation between two systems to improve the completeness of coverage in terms of the registration of vital statistics in Guinea, to strengthen the capacity of healthcare professionals, including community healthcare workers, to improve the registration of all events, including deaths and their causes, based on what is being done in health in this area. Now, I don't think I can end without thanking and without showing our gratitude to donors, to international institutions as well, especially UNICEF, and the African Union and the European Union as well, who have taken all possible steps to provide material support, financial support, technical support as well, to help us to register vital statistics in the Republic of Guinea. It's the opportunity for me now to perhaps call for more efforts to support our government, because today vital statistics really has specific needs, training, for example, equipment, hardware, and also infrastructure needs. There are many shortfalls, shortcomings, despite support from the African Union and the European Union. There are other donors, of course, that support us. They are reliable partners who are helping us to develop our vital statistics registration system in the Republic of Guinea. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Touré, pour...
Very much, Mr. Touré, for your presentation on a specific situation, a health emergency linked to the Ebola crisis in Guinea. I think you have taken my two questions very, very seriously on the lessons learned, first of all, and secondly, on innovation. You raised the issue of communities, the contribution of communities. That's very important. As we heard in the plenary session this morning, vital statistics are known to the community, but how do we capture those vital statistics in the system and then in the vital statistics registration system? Thank you very much. We'll now move on to, well, we're going to be leaving Western Africa and we'll be moving to a more global level, but on the same topics. On the registration of refugees. We heard about refugees in the first two presentations, and we'll now continue. Nicolas Oakeshott is Senior Identity Management Officer, UNHCR, and he will be giving us a general appreciation of CRVS and forced displacement, current challenges and possible solutions. You have the floor. Thank you very much.
Honor here and to sit on this panel and to speak with these distinguished panelists. I'm very grateful to the organizers for having invited me to speak here. As Mirkka said, I'm intending to speak about these issues from a more global and a policy perspective, and to concentrate on the second of the two challenges that she placed for us panelists on innovations and possibilities. What can be done to try to make progress in the area, particularly of the inclusion of refugees within civil registration and vital statistics systems. So, first of all, I'd like to turn to the heightened risks that the forcibly displaced face in respect of identity documentation. Our experience shows us, are at particular risk of having lost their documents in the context of displacement. The very fact of being displaced means that documents may be lost, they may be destroyed, they may be left behind. That leaves them in a situation where often they're left unable to prove their legal identity. We've already heard of the risk of statelessness that exists for refugees and displaced people. This also creates obstacles for those that provide humanitarian assistance to refugees to ensure that that assistance is appropriately targeted and delivered effectively. If identity cannot be ascertained, there's a risk of duplication, there's a risk that what's needed to go to the most vulnerable doesn't in fact reach those people. And the lack of identity documentation, the lack of certainty about identity, can create additional barriers to protection and solutions in the long term. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if we're not sure whether a child is with their family or separated from their family. Are we, as UNHCR, taking appropriate measures to ensure that they are protected? If we're unable to prove, or the individual is unable to prove the country they came from, their nationality, what obstacles may there be in the way of going home when it's safe to do so? That's an example of how the lack of identity documents can get in the way of solutions. So these are key issues that face our populations of concern. The traditional approach to the registration of the displaced, but particularly of refugees, has been for states to, in the context of mass displacement, leave this up to UNHCR. UNHCR would support states by coming in with our expertise and our tools and undertaking the registration of refugees, the functional registration of refugees, during the emergency context. In addition to that, historically, UNHCR has promoted the inclusion of the births of refugee children within states' civil registration and vital statistics system. And we've had reasonable success in that area, but in general, that's been done on the basis where UNHCR is supporting the costs of the registration of each and every individual child. It's not done in a systemic way. It tends to be done in registration drives in the camp setting. And this is part of the challenge, because the majority of refugees, it's not true across the board, but the majority of refugees have tended to be compelled to live in camp settings. And that results often in parallel service provision being provided by humanitarian actors, but also by the partners that work with them. They are left outside often of state systems. And that includes issues of healthcare and indeed health information systems. UNHCR has for many years had its own health information system, and I'm going to talk about some of the developments in that regard. So you see this parallel system that historically has been the approach to dealing with the registration and care and assistance of refugees, particularly in Africa. Now, at present, there is a situation of flux. There's a changing policy landscape in this area, and I would sum that changing policy landscape up through the word of inclusion. The New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, or it should read for refugees and migrants. It's not on refugees and migrants, it's for refugees and migrants. My apologies. And the comprehensive refugee response framework, which is being developed with states in order to implement that declaration, places a strong emphasis upon inclusion. It's a response, that declaration, to the massive increase in the level of forced displacement that we have seen globally in recent years. UNHCR last year, so at the end of, these are figures relating to the end of 2016, reported that there were 65.6 million forcibly displaced people globally, including 22.5 million refugees and 2.8 million asylum seekers. This is a higher numbers than we've seen for many, many years. And the declaration is an attempt to try to find a better way of sharing responsibility and the burden for the care and assistance that refugees need. Now, the zero draft of the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework that UNHCR published just recently includes specific reference to the registration and documentation of refugees in the emergency context, the usual paradigm of states being helped to do that through UNHCR, but it also emphasizes in paragraph 2.5 the importance of the inclusion of the life events within civil registries. Now, this is not final, it's a zero draft, but it's important to recognize the consistency between that framework and the 2030 agenda. The emphasis in Target 16.9 of the Sustainable Development Goals of a legal identity for all and ensuring that no one is left behind. Refugees and forcibly displaced people are recognized as groups for whom there are particular risks that they would be left behind in achieving this agenda. And we also see this inclusion agenda within the regional CRVS ministerial declarations that there have been in Africa and Asia. Both of the declarations in Asia Pacific for 2012 and then the recent declaration last year in December at the Oakeshott specifically referenced the inclusion of refugees, IDPs, and persons at risk of statelessness within civil registration and vital statistic systems. And we're seeing this transition not just taking place at the policy level, but we're seeing an increasing responsibility of state or interest of states in undertaking registration and inclusion in their systems themselves. It's great that Anir is sitting in the front row here. Bangladesh is an example of this because the recent massive influx of the Rohingya to Bangladesh, in that context, the government of Bangladesh chose in the first instance to undertake the functional registration of that group themselves. They didn't follow the usual paradigm of asking us to do it. Now, the reasons behind that are complex, as we've been discussing, but it does show an example of this trend and this change. I think the situation in Sahel that was described earlier, in particular Niger, is another example of this change where states are taking greater responsibility. So what I would like to turn to now are what are some of the other solutions that we could look to try and address this risk of siloing that takes place through the traditional approach to the functional registration of refugees. One of the things I'd like to point to is the new direction that UNHCR is taking on digital identity and the inclusion of refugees. And what we aim to do, we're in the process of developing in detail what this strategy will look like, but what we aim to do is to realize this goal that the High Commissioner has given of a digital identity for all refugees. Now, how do we intend to do that? Well, in three main areas. First of all, empowering refugees. Secondly, through building state capacity in respect of the inclusion of refugees within state systems. And then thirdly, improving service delivery, humanitarian service delivery for refugees through the use of digital identity. The key theme there is building state capacity in this context. How can we support states better to include refugees within their increasingly digitized identity management and civil registration systems? At the core of our digital identity thinking is in fact, our own systems. This is our digital ecosystem, or at least the architecture at a very basic level of this digital ecosystem. We call it PRIMES, a Population Registration and Identity Management Ecosystem. And in that, you see in the center that there are three core applications that we have. Progress version 4, which is our case management tool, which includes biographic data about the populations of concern that we work with. And there are 7.7 million refugees across 130 countries that are currently included within Progress version 4 or its predecessors, version 3. And we're in the process of moving all that data, that biographic data and other case-related data, into the most up-to-date version, version 4. Secondly, there's the biometric system, BIMS, which we use in quite a number of countries. At the moment, there are just under 5 million refugees enrolled either in BIMS or in Iris Guard, which is the system that we use in the MENA region in respect of the Syria response. And then we're also about to roll out a rapid registration tool that works offline to help deal with these emergency situations of that require the registration of refugees, the functional registration of refugees. Now, what I would like to stress here is two things in respect of this diagram. It's first of all the link to partners tools, so UNICEF's Primero, Scope, the possibility of encouraging interoperability there, but also crucially looking at the top of the diagram how there is an intention to encourage interoperability or the development of the functions of interoperability between our system and state civil registration systems. So the idea is to try and break down the potential of silos in this system to facilitate interoperability between our own systems and state civil registration systems. We've seen these sorts of efforts or this sorts of thinking paying fruit in some contexts. I'll refer to the example of Bangladesh again. As a result of an agreement that we had with the Bangladeshi government prior to the last influx of the Rohingya, the registered refugees that were living in the camp that UNHCR was primarily responsible for providing assistance for that group, those that had been born in Bangladesh were retrospectively included within the Bangladesh Civil Registration and Vital Statistics System. And by April 2017, just over 18,500 children had been included within the Bangladesh Civil Registry who previously had only been included in UNHCR's functional registration system that was shared with the government. So there are examples of us sharing this data to increase the inclusion of populations of concern within CRVS systems. But this diagram shows a more systemic attempt to try and set up interoperability in these systems. I'd also like to flag up that we're also developing a new integrated refugee health information system, which is currently being piloted in 5 states. One of the things that we noted, I talked to our colleagues that were responsible for this before I came, but one of the things that we note is that in general, the locations where refugees live in camps are outside the coverage of state health information systems, usually. And so we historically have had to set up our own systems. And this new one is currently, again, focused on camp populations. But one of the things that we hope to do is to make sure that the data is taken from our partners and included within that system, so not just NGOs like Médecins Sans Frontières or others, but also our government partners, and that there is what's hoped to be one streamlined solution from data collection to data consumption in respect of health information for populations of concern, particularly living in the camp context. As I say, it's under development, and I'm not completely on top of all the details, but I think, again, there is an opportunity for trying to break down these walls and these silos. Another opportunity, again, I'm going to flag up at a high level potential solution, is the UNHCR World Bank Group Joint Data Center on Forced Displacement, which was announced at the end of last year and is currently under development. And one of the things that this center will aim to do is provide greater access to UNHCR's internal data, obviously in a way which is sensitive to privacy, and so we're not going to make available data that could identify individuals. But if we go back to this diagram, one of the things that we hope to develop in the center is a data port that will allow data to be taken from our casework and refugee systems and then be shared appropriately with others. And it's hoped that this data center on forced displacement will make available the data not just for the World Bank and for others, but for ourselves, but also for scholars, so that they are able to investigate and research on that data. And then the third solution I'd like to point to is the digitization of CRVS systems themselves. Enabling CRVS systems at a systemic level through digitization can potentially address this underlying issue about refugees living in hard-to-reach areas which are outside the coverage of CRVS systems. This, of course, includes the use of mobile technology. And I think another point which is also important to note, and I've seen it more and more since I moved recently into this headquarters function, is that the policy framework that I was describing earlier on about separation, about siloing, about exclusion, is also reflected often at the legal level. So refugees can sometimes be, and I've seen it in one case just recently, specifically excluded from the legal frameworks for civil registration in particular countries. Civil registration of their births, marriages, or deaths is left to others. It's not left to the state system. And One of the things that we're seeing is that the digitization of CRVS systems is also encouraging states to rethink and review often old and outmoded legislation, and there is an opportunity to address this gap and then ensure inclusion and universality within state systems. So another opportunity that digitization gives. So to sum up, if I may, the changing policy landscape places a greater emphasis on the inclusion of refugees in state systems, including CRVS systems, and digitization and new initiatives provide opportunities to address key gaps and ingrained challenges to the inclusion of refugees within those systems, and to improve access to data and strengthened analysis. I look forward to the discussion and to answering any questions you have. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for this very informative presentation on the global context and UNHCR's role in assisting in refugee registration and making systems more inclusive. We are going towards our final presentation, which will look at the refugee registration more specifically from the context of the Syrian crisis. And this presentation will be given by Marwan Khawaja, who is Chief of Section of Demographic and Social Statistics at the Economic and Social Commission of the United Nations for Central Asia. Sorry, Western Asia. Sorry, my notes are in French. And over to you, Martin.
Yeah,
Marwan.
Thank you very much. I also want to thank the Center of Excellence at IDRC for inviting me to be part of this important conference. What I want to do is share with you a rather small project on CRVS for Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. And this project focuses on death registration. This project was, in fact, initiated by former colleague and friend Romesh Silva, who is with us today. You've heard him yesterday speak in the panels. This was before he defected to UNFPA. He was at UNESCWA. And this work actually was initiated a couple of years back. We got the award from the UN Foundation to do the work. But unfortunately, we never got the funding for it because of legal arguments between the United Nations and the UN Foundation. It's unfortunate, but this is the situation. So I'm going to just, I think Nicola's presentation gave a good introduction and as to the importance of registration of refugees in the host countries in general. So I'm not going to dwell on those. I'm just going to say something about the context for CRVS for refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, and then briefly describe the project, what we're planning to do. So back in 2014 in the region, just to mention that, sorry, I'm sorry, I'll go over it. I totally forgot. Do you
want me to do it for you?
Yeah, please go ahead. So I'm going to jump.
Okay, back.
Perhaps I can skip those.
Okay.
So, as you know from the news, we live in a region where several conflicts have been going on, severe crisis in Syria, Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, what have you. And at this point, I think, according to UNHCR data, the Arab region houses the largest number of refugees in the world. Lebanon, for example, which is one of the countries we're going to focus on, houses a large number of refugees. It's estimated that almost 1 out of 3 who live in Lebanon is a refugee. And this is largely because of the Syria crisis, the war in Syria. As a result of the war, there is an estimated about 6 million internally displaced persons within Syria, and around 5 million refugees in neighboring countries, particularly Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey. We're addressing, actually, this project focuses in 2 very contrasting contexts, very different countries. We have Lebanon with about estimated 1.4 million refugees, registered, 1 million of them registered with UNHCR. Lebanon, the government of Lebanon, asked UNHCR to stop registering birth and deaths, vital events of Syrian refugees. There is no camp policy in Lebanon. Syrian refugees live in informal settlements. Some of them, the middle class, live within the Lebanese community. And we don't really have very good population data on Lebanon itself. The last census was conducted in 1932. While in Jordan, it's a very different situation. We have almost the same number of refugees. According to the last census, 2015 census, there is about 104 million Syrian refugees. Half of those, or less than half of those, 600,000, about 630,000, are registered with UNHCR. 30% of those live in camps, and the vast majority, the rest, live in urban communities, and they're integrated within the Jordanian population. So it's a very, very different situation in both countries. We don't actually have much evidence on registration of civil registration of refugees in Lebanon and Syria. What we have is some data from UNHCR, of course, and then the Norwegian Refugee Council conducted surveys based on quota samples, and they have interesting results. I mean, they're very important. They actually focus more on the legal aspect of registration, but they give us some figures about registration of refugees in Lebanon. Sorry. I will get into those. It's estimated that, for example, for birth registration, for those born in Lebanon, about 17% of the births are registered within the government. So the vast majority of births go unregistered. For refugees who have births occurring, the moms deliver in Syria, within Syria, the vast majority of them, over 90%, were actually registered. These are important data. I just give you the scale of the issues facing refugees in terms of registration. So what did we want to do in this project? Basically, we focus in our region, and our CRVS work focuses on methodological issues, more on the statistics side. So what we wanted to do is first evaluate the strength and weakness of CRVS system for Syrian refugees in both countries, and to promote knowledge sharing and coordination efforts among the national authorities and international organizations working in the field to improve the responsiveness of civil registration process to meet the needs of refugees. And also we wanted to help the government of Jordan and Lebanon to produce vital statistics from these registration data. It's really, the project is divided into two parts. It's staged. Initially, we wanted to conduct focus group interviews and roundtable discussions and get some qualitative evidence about obstacles facing refugees to register the vital events, specifically deaths. And then to do some quantitative assessment of the completeness and the quality of registration in both countries, using essentially, depending on the country, indirect methods. We have recent census data from Jordan, and then we wanted to try to do some record linkage, hoping that UNHCR would share with us their registration data, to try to link these data with household survey data and also census data in Jordan, and also recently in Lebanon. Not recently, actually, it's been going on. Several surveys were done by UNHCR and the World Bank on focusing on poverty issues. We also wanted to do some studies on those, on record linkage with those studies. This project was actually in collaboration, was designed in collaboration with UNHCR, WHO Regional Office, and UNICEF, and we have another of non-UN partners. I don't have the time to go over some data with you, but it's just for just an example from the vulnerability assessment survey that was conducted by UNHCR in 2016. As I mentioned, only 17% of parents with children born in Lebanon actually managed to register the births. I do want to, perhaps, Ramesh, would you be willing to go over some of the remaining slides, because we did some testing of using the Jordanian census, using indirect methods to make an assessment of coverage of death registration. Just, is okay? No.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Thanks, Marwan. Yeah, just to try to elaborate on 4 particular points, which Marwan kind of gave us the background on. I think one of the things which the work by the Norwegian Refugee Council has really unpacked in a very clear way is the interdependence of registering vital events for Syrian refugees, both in Jordan and Lebanon. The issue here is that for birth, marriage, and death registration, it's a multi-step process. And so, for example, to register a birth of a child in both countries, the parents actually need to furnish the local civil registration authorities with a marriage certificate. And as I think our colleague from UNHCR, Nick Oakeshott, very clearly outlined that documentation loss when crossing international borders, in emergency situations is a major issue. And so that really is playing out in a big way. Marwan mentioned the November 2015 population and housing census by Jordan, and as he's showing, the census questionnaire included a number of very innovative additional questions on household deaths in the last 24 months, which can be disaggregated by age, sex, whether or not the death was registered, the marital status of the person at death, and whether the death was pregnancy-related, in addition to whether the person, the country of birth of the person, and whether they're a Syrian refugee. Now, one of the things here, though, is that, as Marwan mentioned, the estimate here by UNHCR is that, you know, there's around half of Syrian refugees in Jordan, of the 1.4 million, who are actually registered with UNHCR. What's interesting from, you know, the data from the Population and Housing Census is that Syrian refugees who were enumerated in the census self-report that they believe, over 90% of them self-report that they are registered with UNHCR. And so I wanted to highlight this in terms of inconsistency of data sources. What we see, and this is not just something which is particular to emergency settings, but perhaps it's more acute in an emergency setting where some of our methods of assessing completeness and quality of civil registration rely heavily on self-reporting. And when one's moving across an international border, you're moving into a new environment where, you know, registration is different, whether it's being registered as a refugee or being registering a vital event. And so I think we've seen, and the Norwegian Refugee Council has documented, that what somebody considers a registration process is not necessarily registration by the official authorities. The classic example, which I think colleagues from UNICEF have well documented in many places, is that a number of people equate birth notification or death notification with civil registration, and it's certainly not the same. Birth notification is an initial step in a multi-step process towards a registration of a vital event. I'll just conclude very quickly by saying that we have been studying the population census data from Jordan, at least some of the preliminary released data by the Department of Statistics. And although we can't disaggregate the data by Syrian refugees versus Jordanian nationals, at the moment we're able to disaggregate the data by Jordanian nationals versus non-Jordanian nationals. And what we see is that, at least according to the Population and Housing Census of 2015 in Jordan, that based on that data, the estimate for death registration completeness amongst adults between 15 and 60 of Jordanian nationals is about 50%, whereas for non-Jordanians, the death registration completeness for adults is around 20. So, you know, stark sort of differential there in terms of one's ability to register a death. And I think this also speaks to a larger question around incentives and disincentives around registration. We know a lot about the incentives around birth registration, and perhaps this is another area where there's even more acute disincentives around death registration in emergency settings, particularly when a family is, you know, heavily reliant on assistance from UNHCR or the World Food Programme. Perhaps you don't want to register that death or with the local authorities because it would change, you know, your humanitarian assistance in the short term. But I think we should examine what the long-term implications of this are. From a longer-term implication, if you haven't registered a marriage or a death while you've been in asylum or sought refuge in another country, when the war's over and you go home and you try to reclaim your property, which may have actually been listed in the name of your spouse, you may have a number of additional problems. And so I think one of the things which I'm hoping our panelists and audience might be able to discuss a little bit is these sort of short-term versus long-term incentive and disincentive challenges and how we might be able to address that as an international community trying to strengthen CRVS systems in very, very difficult circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I just conclude, or I don't have time? Yeah. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. What we learned, I just also want to highlight the fact that for at least in Lebanon, the many refugees cannot actually, cannot access residency permits, and it's expensive for them. So the vast majority of them, in order to go through the system, they need to be legal residents of Lebanon. So what we learn is that we have very limited data on birth registration and death registration completeness of Syrian refugees in Jordan and Lebanon. Most of the evidence come from small-scale and convenient sample, mainly from the Norwegian Refugee Council. And then, although, as Ramesh mentioned, we get these numbers from the indirect methods, the distribution methods, there are many questions about the reliability of such estimates. And there is, as I said, a great opportunity to be on the innovation side, to try some record linkage studies to link, to assess the completeness of birth and death registration completeness in both Jordan and Lebanon, and also, as Nicholas mentioned, to use some innovative techniques. We're planning to do this in terms of household survey data, using respondent-driven sampling, for example, for the hard-to-reach population. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marwan, for this very interesting presentation on the situation of the Syrian refugees and the situation in the neighboring countries. So this concludes our round of presentations. Thank you for patience. Thank you for your patience. And now I will open the floor for any questions or comments you may have to the panelists, or if you have anything to share from your own experience, that would be most welcome. So this is over to you. I think you will have to use the microphone that is over there.
Bonjour à tous.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Carlos Ramirez. I'm statistician at the Colombian Statistics Office. I would just like to tell you how we do it in Colombia right now. We are receiving a lot of Venezuelans in our country, and normally we don't welcome too many immigrants. So I can say that our government is not really prepared to understand what has to be done with immigrants, especially from Venezuela. For the time being, the Colombian government has proposed to have a special identification permanent permit. And just to receive that permit, they have to be working. And once they get the permit, they can have access to health services, education, and social services. But afterwards, we estimate that between 1 million of the Venezuelans who immigrated to Colombia have a document. So it's starting to be a problem. They don't have paperwork in many cases. So right now we are a part of a framework including many organizations, health organizations, as well as my own institution, the National Statistics Institute or Bureau. And we want to build a system that would include all the databases from these institutions, because there's a register for immigrations, and we know that the people would be included. But the government in Colombia is not really too concerned with this, because the immigrants can come through any point of entry, and they don't know how long they'll be in Colombia. It's hard to have a cross-section of the information and as to how much time they are in Colombia, because there are many people from Venezuela that go through Colombia in order to go to other Latin America countries, Chile or Argentina or Panama. So for the time being, I hope that things will go well with all the combination of databases. We'll see what happens. But I just wanted to know, Mr. Malawa, sorry. You have used indirect methods in order to find out or to estimate how many people are on the ground and their socio-demographic characteristic, yes? I'd just like to know what you did. What was the purpose of this indirect methodology that you mentioned? And finally, I'd like to know what you think in terms of these temporary permits that we use in Colombia. We provide the documents to only people who are working and who have a residence. Thank you very much for that question. And your small presentation about Colombia, did you want to answer right now?
These are standard methods in demography to assess the completeness of registration data. So normally we use indirect methods. The growth balance, one of the methods used by Romesh, actually my colleague Romesh, is there are a lot of assumptions behind these methods. Sometimes we get very strange data. It's probably the level of coverage is probably more than the ones reported from anecdotal evidence. But these are the standard methods to assess completeness. Now we are moving towards more direct methods, just to match records from more than one source of data. And then we can see, using the dual system estimation, how many we're actually missing in the registration system. But we're using data from the registration and another source for the indirect methods, like the census, the one we used here, the 2015 census, and then data from registration for those reference periods. We're not getting any additional information about characteristics of the population. It's just really using the figures from two sources for those registered, and then there is an indirect methods in demography that regression line basically that assesses completeness. That's it. Did I answer your question? No.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi.
Deborah Jackson, UNICEF. Je voulais vous demander, nous avons fait du travail dans certains pays, ce qui comprend le Soudan du Sud. Et le pays vient d'adopter une loi il y a un mois, mais nous avons depuis un an utilisé des formulaires de notification de naissance. On a dit que les réfugiés ne reconnaissent peut-être pas l'importance.
Is that people were thrilled. We've got pictures where we just put out a table in a camp to register births, and we were swamped. And the people that we spoke to in the camps talked about the because they were displaced or whatever, having something to say who they were for their children was so important. And so I wondered maybe across the different situations that you've seen, are there differences across populations? And, what might be the lessons in populations that are interested? What about those populations makes them more interested in having these, it wasn't even an official registration, it was the notification, but they still felt, I've got something for my child, and that's important. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah. Let's take a couple of more questions because this was more for several panelists. So Anina and then, okay, then we'll go in order.
Cool. Thank you, Mirkka. And thanks to all the panelists for their great presentations. Very interesting. My name is Anina Warson. I'm from Plan International. I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay. The first one really targeted towards Dimitri, but all of you, please feel free to answer. You mentioned that these are long-term issues and, living in these emergency contexts is not necessarily going to change anytime soon. So really a question is, do we need to be looking at, guidelines on how to deal with this? And or do we need to be looking at fundamental changes in the way we look at civil registration and service delivery, recognizing that living in emergency contexts and all those different types of emergencies is just becoming more frequent and more sustained. A question specifically to Nick. Thank you very much and very excited to see UNHCR's plans. Really just a question around, we know that these kind of things take quite some time, and especially agreeing with governments on integration, etc. Are UNHCR planning to test out some of these use cases kind of on a small basis, over a short period of time? Or is this, really just understand the plans and whether we can see some of these use cases come to life to demonstrate the value, whether there's some plans in the kind of shorter term. And then last question to Marwan. A question and really opinion, and perhaps Nick wants to respond to this as well. I understand that returns to Syria will start kind of sooner rather than later, from my understanding. What kind of challenges do you think people are going to face without documentation? And is anyone looking at this problem at the moment? Obviously, they seem to need civil registration documents prior to the conflict. So, is anyone looking at that problem yet? Or do you think, what are the ways in which we could look at addressing that problem? Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have the next question over there.
Thank you very much to the speakers for great presentations. My name is Chris Seabrex from Gembi Health Systems, a South African NPO that we're working with the Intergovernmental Agency for Development on immunization systems for mobile populations in East Africa and the Horn. My question really is to UNHCR around the systems that you've been presenting and the data that's associated with those systems. So in particular, where's that data stored? Are you storing that within the UN agency environment, or is the data localized within the countries? And is there any guidance from the organizations working with this personally identifiable data around the movement of data across borders and between the different countries that you're working in? Do you have any guidance for us who are broaching similar issues? Thanks.
Thank you. Let me invite the panelists to respond to these questions before we move to the next round. So should we start with Nick? You had quite a number of questions, so please.
Thanks, Mirkka. I don't want to monopolize the discussion. I'll take them in reverse order. On the data, I can't tell you what the plan is about where the data would be held for the health information system. I don't know. It's being piloted in 5 countries. I don't know if it's going to be held in data in national level databases or at a central level. For Progress version 4 and BIMS, and I presume the emergency registration tool that's being developed, that is held in centralized databases in the cloud, but it's in a UN context. The transition that we're making from version 3 of Progress to version 4 is that previously the data in version 3 was held in national service. And then, so the transfer that we're making is moving it into the centralized server, the centralized data store under version 4, which is a big data transition. For BIMS, it's always been held in a centralized data, on a centralized server. In terms of our policies and framework, we have a data protection policy, which describes how we treat data, but we don't have specific guidelines about that I'm aware of. I'll go back and check, but about the transition of or the transfer of data cross-border, because we're living in the UN global context. One of the challenges that we're seeing is that states are increasingly saying that data in respect of their people on their territory needs to be held in servers on their territory, and how we adjust to that with the configuration of our systems is a challenge. I can't say any more about that right now, but it's something that we face. On the returns to Syria, it's not something that we're promoting at this stage, obviously, but we talked about this the other day, and I did follow up with colleagues, and yes, of course, we're thinking about these sorts of issues. So it is something that is being thought about. On your question about use cases for the digital identity work, yes, we are looking at least 3 pilots. At this stage, we don't know whether that will include the sort of interoperability that I was talking about, but I imagine it will be part of the thinking, and we're certainly looking to develop the capacity for interoperability by understanding what the different systems are, like your open CRVS system, and whether we can whether that capacity and capability can be there. On the question about birth notifications, we find exactly what you said, that the displaced people want documentation. They want to be able to show that who they are, and that preferably that they have a right to be in the territory of the state that they're in, and they're able to access entitlements as a result as well. The challenge is often that the sort of documentation that is issued is misunderstood as to what it actually is. So a birth notification is understood to be a birth certificate, and it's understood that the child's birth, the life event, is included in the civil registry, when often it's not. And that when children register or their births are registered with us, we have a continuous process of registration. That's just updating our functional record. It's not necessarily ensuring that that child's birth is included within the civil registry of the host state. And that's the gap in awareness that needs to be addressed, because in terms of legal identity, there's only so much UNHCR or others can do, or health services can do. It's about inclusion in the civil registry primarily, or the population register, which is crucial. And I think that goes, Ramesh, to your point.
Thank you, Nicola. There was at least one question for Dimitri, and also if you want to address others.
Yes. Thank you very much. Let me address 2 questions at the same time. Our colleague from Plan International, as well as our colleague from UNICEF. I think there are 2 ways of looking at the same problem. There's a demand and then the supply. People are really excited they want to exist. They want to be linked to their country of origin, or if they are internal displaced people, they want to know where they are, and so on. But I think in that case, the case of refugees, internally displaced people, and so on, the problem is on the supply side. And I very much liked the intervention of our colleague from UNHCR here. Member states, at least in Africa, where we started a big program on accelerated improvement of civil registration, you will see that when you are in emergency situations, the government leave UNHCR, Plan International, and so on to deal with the issue. But this is a primary responsibility of member states. They are all members of the UN, and they are supposed to register any events that occur on their territory. There are some fears of my giving a birth certificate or something like that might be in the future the entry point for the person to claim citizenship and so on. We have seen that through the conference of ministers that we have organized. And then we were explaining to them that this is not really the case. It even protects the country when you register whoever is on your territory by linking the person to where the person comes from, so that tomorrow they will not come and then claim the citizenship on the country where they were as a refugee. So they understood that it's the responsibility of the government to register whatever event that occur on your territory. So we have to play on both sides. On the demand, I think there's no problem there. The problem is on the supply side. A good example of that is that we found out in the Difa region that there were refugees who came 40 years ago. There were small children and so on who came when there were troubles in Chad. And then they went to Niger. Now that situation are making that Chad is more or less a little bit more secure than Niger, at least in that region of Difa. So these people want to go back. Now the problem was that the government has to say, okay, I would like these people to come back, but who are they? Are they from Niger or are they from Chad? So I need some thing that will prove that. So you will see that everybody wanted to have a birth certificate or whatever, but the fact is that Niger did not give them something, Chad did not give them something, though they are in between the two. So I think these are some of the issues what we have to look at. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have about 7 minutes, so let me invite perhaps 3 more questions, so we'll have time for answers as well. So we had the gentleman over there and here, and then Ramesh in the back, and that's 3.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This would be just sharing an experience rather than a question. I am Dr. Parvez Nayani, and I am coming from Afghanistan, another conflict area. And I belong to Aga Khan University, which is an entity under Aga Khan Development Network. And we are working in Afghanistan in several areas, including in academic areas. In one of the remote province, Badakhshan, we have established a surveillance system in selected areas where every pregnancy at the time of information and every birth is registered up to 42 days. Now, as you know, the area is not peaceful. So we do face difficulties in visiting and confirming each pregnancy and each birth. Wherever there are fights or conflicts, we have tried to develop relations with different parties who may be fighting with each other, but fortunately, we have been able to convey to them that we don't have any political motives or otherwise. We just want to serve, and registration would be useful for the population at large. So I just want to share that we usually talk about innovations and similar things. This may be one of the way we can work even in those difficult areas. And here, I just want to add a couple of things. Not only registration of births and deaths, but next stage, we are introducing autopsies of the deaths so that we know exactly what are the reasons for such deaths. Now, this all information is at a pilot stage, but we are now proposing to government of Afghanistan to have a sample registration system throughout Afghanistan based on our initial work. And for that, obviously, we will look forward to have support. This project is being supported by Global Fund Canada, so we are grateful to them. But we hope that we can continue with this work, expand it, and link it with the National Health Information System, which is at the preliminary stages. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you very much for sharing your experience from Afghanistan. Next question or comment, please.
Thank you. Two questions, actually. One is, as we're looking at the emergency situations, conflict situations, are we looking at it from a CRVS perspective, or are we looking at it from an emergency situations perspective? Because when we look at the individual, not even the collective, let's say an individual facing the emergency, what are the needs? Food, non-food items, health, education, skills development, financial inclusion perhaps, protection from trafficking, gender-based violence. These are some of the things. So looking at it and maybe designing a human-centered approach to solving those, where can CRVS really help? Are we collecting the right data? Different agencies obviously are collecting different types of data according to their needs, right? So to generate a response, appropriate response, different agencies need to work together by sharing data and creating a collective response. So are we doing it from that angle? Or are we doing it from a CRVS database angle? So CRVS database has specific points of data that we collect. And that cannot generate appropriate response in many situations, even though we have basically fulfilled the needs of CRVS. So that's my first question. What are your thoughts on that? And the second is we saw the use of electronic identity more and more in recent times, because we want to identify that person uniquely in emergency situations. What is the use of biometric in all these areas and the possible risks associated with it, child biometric use, so on and so forth? Again, your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And then the last question from Romesh, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I wanted to pick up on a point made by Nicholas in his presentation, but also by Dimitri just a few moments ago. And this was this kind of groundswell of political sort of momentum and support around inclusion through the global compacts on migration and refugees. And link it with some of the discussions around interoperability. And I think you focused quite a bit on interoperability from a sort of technological and a sort of digital data standpoint, but you gave us a very nice example of the response by the government of Bangladesh to the recent Rohingya crisis. And if we think about refugee situations and complex emergencies, by and large, the refugee flows overwhelmingly are at a regional, or more accurately, a sub-regional level. And Dimitri mentioned very helpfully some of the interministerial level CRVS proclamations through the Economic Commission for Africa and the Economic and Social Commission for Asia Pacific. And so my question really is, perhaps this is a moment to think with more foresight and boldness. We've learnt a lot in the humanitarian setting that humanitarian preparedness is a key component to effective humanitarian response. And so I'm wondering what the role here is of technical cooperation and communication at the sub-regional level between different civil registration authorities, so that, to Dimitri's point, registering vital events is actually a key state security function, in addition to being a fantastic function to advance the rights of individuals, regardless of their nationality and state. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to give each panelist 1 minute to respond and share their final conclusions. Can we start with you, Marwan?
Thank you very much for the comments. I think one important issue that was mentioned by my colleague here is that we often see the case that states are not really keen on issues of registration and also producing vital statistics for their resident population. According to the recommendations, United Nations recommendations, each member state is actually required to do so for all persons residing in that state. So I think this is a challenge, and I think in our project we wanted to devote quite a bit of attention to engaging policymakers in changing the situation and making them more perceptive to registration issues. They are very practical. The process of registration is usually very involved. I mean, in Lebanon, you have to go through 3 or 4 steps, and then give money, fees, and all of that. And so these are some of the challenges I think that we're facing in this kind of work. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the questions. And you always put your finger on great points. So on the biometrics, I think it's very interesting. We don't children under the age of 5, we won't enroll within our biometric system. We are increasingly rolling out our biometrics in the emergency and protracted situations to a wide number of operations. As part of the Grand Bargain, we pledged to roll it out to 75 countries by the end of 2019. It is an increasingly important tool for us in order to ensure that assistance is appropriately targeted. We link it to various tools that we have, including a distribution tool, which is one of the reasons, actually, that we've been asked to go into Uganda and enroll the refugee population there within our biometric system, to try and make sure that assistance is distributed appropriately and fraud and duplication is avoided. These are so it's an increasing part in our work. What I think we want to move towards with our digital identity approach is to facilitate the empowerment of individuals as a result of this, not only in ensuring that the humanitarian assistance is provided in an appropriate and effective way, but to try and allow individuals to make the use of that data. If we as UNHCR, for example, could be a trusted source for identity, would that help refugees register SIM cards? Would that help them access mobile money and meet KYC requirements? What role can we play in that regard if the population is excluded? On your point about prioritization, our approach, as you've probably seen from our emergency handbook, is that the registration of refugees when the population is stable in the emergency context is the first priority. In order to ensure that life-saving assistance can be appropriately distributed, shelter provided. These are the essential needs. CRVS is not high up in that agenda. That sort of response comes later down the line. In fact, in the Bangladesh context, it's coming now. I think what we've seen, in our experience of the functional registration of refugees, which is the primary priority in the emergency setting, is the need to ensure that that's done in an effective way, that households and families are grouped, and that can be used. We've been discussing this. I think that one of the challenges that, again, we've been discussing this in the Bangladesh context, is how can the different data sets that are in existence or under contemplation can be linked up in a way that all the humanitarian partners can use them appropriately in a way which can ensure the efficient delivery and protection of the population. Delivery of services and the protection of the population, and that in a very complex environment. I think we need to do more as a UN, but also working with states like yourselves if that's possible at the national level. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Bon, en ce qui concerne la République de Guinée, les personnes qui ont...
Well, in terms of the Republic of Guinea, people who have a need in an emergency situation are accounted for by emergency organizations, and they're also helped by the local government. Food is provided, and we make sure that their health needs are taken care of as well. Really, humanitarian assistance is provided by neighboring countries. In many cases, in the case of disease or epidemics like Ebola that occurred in our country in 2014, 2015, well, that led to action by institutions, governments, and people who are willing to act in various different capacities. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. One of the colleagues was saying, is this a human-centered approach or a CRVS approach or perspective? For me, there's only one perspective. CR is about putting human being at the center. As a matter of fact, this is the only, for people like myself and other statisticians, this is the only statistical operation that puts the human being at the center. Look at the census, look at the surveys. You go and knock at the door and tell someone to give you information, not for him, for policy decision-making for the community, for the region, for the country. So to sell it, you are saying, I will collect your personal information, but when we will pull all this together, it will help us undertake policy decision-making that will affect you. This is the other way around with civil registration. It is first and foremost for the person, the identity of the person, to protect the person against whatever, to make sure that when the child will be 5 years old or 6 years old and want to go to school, has to prove the identity and so on. It is first human being centered. And then when we aggregate this information, we can come with the vital statistics that can now serve policies. So for me, there's no ambiguity there. It is human-centered, and this is the basis on which, at least in Africa, we have built the Africa Program on Accelerated Improvement of Civil Registration. Second, there was one colleague who was saying we need to approach this on a regional or sub-regional basis. And again, in Africa, for example, going from an African program tells these governments that you cannot yourself only solve the problem of civil registration. You have to take into account the fact that you have neighbors. If you don't register your own people, if they move tomorrow, you will have 20 years down the road the difficulty of identifying your own people if you want them to come back. So we need to adopt a regional approach. It is a must. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. I'm just going to conclude. I think we've heard a lot of the lessons learned, but in terms of the innovations, that was kind of the theme of the conference and theme of this session as well, linked to emergencies and crisis. I noted three things. One is based on the presentations and based on the experiences that were shared from the audience. The first one is that we need to mobilize communities to improve vital event registration. They have the information. The second one, the use of health sector and services is really critical, as we've heard, especially in reaching out to the most vulnerable populations. And the third one is making services mobile for mobile populations. I think those three are some of the elements that I gathered from this discussion. Thank you. This will continue. I mean, this is just one session. We will be here for the next 2 days. So thank you once more for all the panelists. Thank you for the participants. And now I think it's best time of the day, lunch. Thank you.